Empathy is a skill set, and it is the skill set of being able to recognize the perspective of someone else. So it's a very functional, rational ability. It's something you're born with, and it's something that as humans we need to survive. And because it's a skill set, the less you use it, the less practiced you become at it. This is a hard skill. It's hard to find, it's hard to master, and it has hard business results. I believe that listening is the backbone to all empathy, because if you don't listen, you can't understand. We tell each other to listen, but when do we teach each other to listen? Psychological safety and innovation are directly connected. When you have high levels of empathy, you have high levels of safety, innovation goes up, productivity goes up, performance goes up, motivation goes up, profit goes up by 23%.
Ever feel like your best decisions hit a wall when you step outside your comfort zone, especially when dealing with different cultures at work? Welcome to Upward Spiral, the podcast that believes intentional decisions are the engine for transformative personal growth across all areas of your life, from your well-being to your career. So if you're a professional navigating the global landscape, aiming for that next level of leadership, or simply wanting to connect more authentically with your colleagues worldwide, then this episode is specifically for you. I'm your host, Michelle O'Brien, and after spending over a decade immersed in the vibrant cultures of Asia, I've learned firsthand that understanding the different perspectives isn't just polite, it's powerful. And joining me today is someone who embodies this global understanding. Our guest is a best-selling author who's on a mission to reconnect 1 million people through empathy. She's been ranked as Malaysia's #1 workplace wellbeing leader and has trained tens of thousands of professionals globally in the art of human connection. From the bustling streets of Hong Kong to the serene landscapes of Sri Lanka, she's lived and breathed diverse cultures. With her infectious energy and profound insights, please now welcome the incredible Mimi Nicklin. Oh, I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you. That introduction was amazing. You know, every time I hear it, and yours was a special one, I sit and listen and think, did I do all of that? Of course I did, but it's amazing to hear it. So thank you for such a beautiful introduction.
Oh, and you know, I could have kept going. Honestly, I feel like that's just the tip of the iceberg of what you've achieved.
Well, it's nice to hear that from someone else. I think probably, certainly for me, but probably for all women, or many women, I should say. When you hear it from other people, it's a real, I don't know if it's a relief or just a confidence boost.
Yeah.
But when I hear you say, you know, all the things you've achieved, I think, did I? You know, did I already achieve that? So yeah, it's very exciting.
I think when you're in the thick of it, it's like you don't realize. And I did an exercise recently and just took a step back and had a look at what I'd achieved in the last kind of 12 to 18 months. And I was like, oh, okay, you know, and because sometimes you don't lift your head out of it enough to really appreciate how far you've come.
And celebrate the small moments. Michelle, I think that's such an important piece. We run so fast. The world is so fast, right? Everything is fast life, fast food, fast grab, fast everything.
Yeah.
To actually stop and think, you know, I did that thing, or that's worth celebrating. And sometimes it's a really small thing.
Yeah.
I think we have to have real intention to do that, because otherwise, as you said, 18 months goes by, you don't even notice, you know?
It's a blink. And then sometimes you just feel like you're not getting there, you know? You have a vision and you maybe have a timeline and you're like, oh, I'm not getting there. But when you do poke your head out of the water, you realize how far you've come and you think, okay, you know, I am still on the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. Progress over perfection.
Absolutely. I love it. But today we are here to talk about cross-cultural empathy.
Yes.
And I'll maybe get into the reasons shortly as to why I want to cover this topic. Because as I can be sometimes on this podcast, a little bit selfish, because I get these amazing guests and I'm like, oh, you can help me with this problem that I've got. But before that, I would just love to hear from you your definition of empathy.
Oh, yes. Empathy is fundamentally perspective taking. So we're talking about the ability to recognize or understand the reality or the opinion or the perspective of somebody else. So it's a skill that is really, really misunderstood, because a lot of people think maybe it's an emotion or it's sympathy or it's pity or compassion. But empathy is a skill set. And it is the skill set of being able to recognize the perspective of someone else. So it's a very functional, rational ability, which is actually built into the prefrontal cortex of your brain. So it's something you're born with, and it's something that as humans we need to survive.
Okay. Oh my God. Okay. There's quite a lot to unpack in here.
I should have done a quick one, shouldn't I? I should have just said perspective taking.
Yeah, I know. But then But you've almost made it sound physiological.
Well, it is. I mean, it's built into your brain. You're born. I mean, there's a very small percentage of the world that is born without this, and they tend to have some level of neuropathic differences in their brain, shall we say, different ways of thinking and approaching life. But for the majority of the human race, 98% of us, we are born with this because we're a pro-social species. So we need to connect to be able to survive.
Then why do so many of us struggle with it?
It's the $1 million question. The short answer is that empathy has two great enemies. One is low time, and the other is high stress. And if you asked your audience, please put your hand up if you have low time and high stress, right? Exactly, right? Everybody is going to put their hand up. Yeah. So it's, as a skill set, you have to practice it, you have to use it, you have to be intentional about it. And often we just don't make or create the time to do that. And because it's a skill set, the less you use it, the less practiced you become at it. So when we actually started there at the beginning of this conversation, right, talking about speed and everything's so fast, to actually stop and understand somebody else needs you to stop and understand. So time and stress, I mean, I'm putting it simply, but those two are huge realities for, at least in the working world, why we don't see enough of it.
I will be completely honest. I think in my last corporate role was Disney, huge, big organization. We were under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. We were launching Disney Plus. I was part of the team to launch Disney Plus across Southeast Asia, Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I always felt I had a lot of empathy for my colleagues. But after doing an episode with Joseph Cope on the podcast, I think I realized what I had was sympathy and compassion. You know, if someone was going through a hard time, I would have a lot of sympathy for that. I would have a lot of compassion. I would make a lot of allowances for that. I would often talk to my team across the region and, you know, try to draw as much as I could out of them. But the reality is, I didn't always take the time to really see and understand their perspectives.
I think, I mean, I hear it a huge amount. We are living through a deficit of empathy. So we have now lost 48% of this skill set in the last 3 decades. So the good news is you're not alone.
Okay. Yeah.
The bad news is there's too many of us that struggle with the same reality because we need it, right? We need to be connected. We need to belong. We need to feel seen and heard. It is just fundamental to every baby that is born.
Yeah.
So it's something I hear all the time. I think, again, particularly in the corporate world, because of the pressure, because of the time pressure, because of the goals and the KPIs and the objectives and the stress and the politics and all of those things. It's hard. It's really hard. I mean, I always say to people, this is a hard skill. It's hard to find, it's hard to master, and it has hard business results. But there is a rhetoric out there that will say this is a soft skill, which let's end today on your show, right?
Yeah.
It's not soft. This is a hard thing to work with. So I think your reality that you're describing puts you in the 90%.
Yeah. And I think you know, like you said, you're so busy. We're so stressed. I didn't always take the time. And then there's the cultural nuance and the cultural differences. So my Western colleagues at Disney, we were able to connect. We were a lot more open about how we were feeling, what we were doing, what we were thinking, thoughts on this project. Whereas maybe some of my more Eastern and Asian colleagues weren't so open because of that kind of those cultural nuances, those cultural differences. And, you know, there are only so many times that you can ask somebody to open up. And if they are unwilling to do so, it's very hard to get the information that you need in order to, practice empathy, I suppose. How can we do that?
Yeah, look, I think a couple of things come to my mind. The first thing that's interesting is, you know, when I listen to you, and if someone looked at us, right, given the color of our skin, they would think we come from the same culture, which of course we did, as in we were both born in the same country.
Yeah.
But it's funny when I listen to you, because I've been in Asia my entire career, 20 years, I feel the other way around. I find it far harder today, or let's say I have to work harder to understand Western organizational culture than I do Eastern, because I've been there so long. So the one thing that just came to mind is that culture is not necessarily something you're born into, but something that you can learn and adapt to. So for anyone who's listening, who's thinking, yes, like I totally resonate, totally empathize with what Michelle is saying, that's a real challenge. Time does solve that. Time and intention, right? Because You have to want to fix it.
Yeah.
If you sit in your bubble, you can't.
Step before that, you have to be aware of it. So,
True.
I think I've been in Asia 11 years, which is significant.
Yeah.
But I don't, until again, kind of earlier this year in my conversation with Joseph Cope, I wasn't aware. I don't think I was aware of that in order to then spend the time to work on it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I have a really simple model that I work with in the corporate world, and you're right. The first step is awareness. The second is intention. And the third is measurement. Because you're right, you absolutely have to be aware that you want to lean into those worlds. I would say the second thing, based on what you were saying just then, is you are right, particularly in Eastern Asian cultures, that desire to, as you phrased it, open up, I was going to say overshare, but just to openly share is certainly less than you would find in the West. But that doesn't mean that you can't still have empathy for those people that aren't sharing, because you don't always have to form your empathy through verbal communication, right? So the more time you spend with a team, even if they're not telling you their personal realities, to be able to empathize with how they're working today, how they're clearly experiencing a meeting, how fast they're growing or not growing, how they're communicating or not, are all different forms of empathy that you can build your curiosity, fundamentally, your human data, right, around those people. So you may never understand them to a level that you would in the West. But again, that's not necessarily a barrier. It's just a cultural difference, right? So the empathy would be slightly different in that space. I remember when I first started working in Hong Kong, I was very young, maybe 23 or 24 or something. I was very young. And I had a team that was below me in terms of level. And I couldn't understand why they were sending me emails at close to midnight, right? I didn't know. And I didn't, to your point, I didn't know to ask. So I just sort of watched for a while. And then a few months later, I can't remember how long, probably 6 months, somebody told me over a coffee that they were going to continue to send me messages at nearly midnight until I told them it was okay to go home before then. And I had no idea. Yeah. And I was so young anyway, I was a young leader in that time. They were even younger, right?
Yeah.
But no one at that time had ever said, hey, Mimi, there is a hierarchical structure here. And simply by your job title, you need to instruct this team how you want them to behave. And of course, coming at that time from the West, it was my first work over here in Asia. I couldn't imagine that because you wouldn't have had to do that in London. I didn't have to tell someone when they could go home in a different culture. So there's all kinds of different ways to uncover that empathy. Fundamentally, it's about data, understanding how your team is experiencing the same thing that you are differently.
Okay, I love this because I think, I've always relied on, okay, what are they telling me? Yes, I will pick up on other cues, but okay, let's talk through these different cues.
Yeah.
What are they? What should we be looking out for?
So I think the first one is fundamental to their behavior. I think even if somebody doesn't tell you that they're unhappy or uncomfortable in an environment, if you are aware, if you have the intention to be interested, it's very easy to see, right? Mm-hmm. Because in the end, as human beings, we're all far more alike than we are different. It doesn't matter what language we speak or where we come from or what gender we are or any of those things, right? As humans, we experience things in very similar ways. Uncomfortable people are uncomfortable people, right? So I think that's the first thing. I think secondly, growth is something you can see. So if someone isn't growing, there will be a reason for it. Human behavior always has a reason. There's a reason that they're not getting promoted or growing into that role or being able to achieve what you hope for them to achieve. And I think that's a real nuance as well, because what I also learned in this journey is that as Westerners and from Western cultures, we want people to grow because we think that's what they should do. You should start as an exec and then you should become a manager and then you move to direct. Like there's a ladder and you should climb it. But often across these cultures, people don't necessarily want to climb that ladder, right? They're absolutely happy where they are. They may want to stay in that role for 25 years and you may never really understand why, right?
Yeah.
But you have to accept it. In that empathy, you have to understand for that person's reality, this is enough for them. And I think social structure has a huge role to play in that. A lot of my work is with women in the Gulf and South Asia, South and Southeast Asia, but predominantly South. So India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and then up the Gulf. In those countries, the social reality for women in the workplace has a long long way to go. I'm not talking about organizational acceptance or inclusion or diversity or any of those policies that we have in the workplace. No. I'm talking about social structures. To be a woman in those families, in those structures today, you have a huge amount of responsibility outside of the organization that is not going to change in this generation or probably even the next. So for those women, whether they want to become a leader or not, that's a different discussion. Understanding them involves understanding societal context. You cannot understand that female leader if you don't understand the family she comes from, because they're completely intertwined. That idea of personal life and professional life being completely separate has no grounding. It never did. I think it was created by men, like in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right? It never existed, especially for women. There are no two halves of us, right? We are just us.
Yeah.
So I think that empathy, especially when you're looking across cultures, has to be wider than how are you doing in this role, on this job, on these emails, for you to be able to grow in that understanding of them. Does that make sense? I know it sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, and it does. It kind of comes back to that point where, like, you're so stressed, you've got so much to get done, and taking that time, and especially if you're working across the region, to understand that the differences between Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, just like Southeast Asia alone is wild. How different these countries that are sitting next to each other are.
Yeah.
And then adding that layer on to look at the societal elements of your different employees. You might have like a woman who's in her early 20s versus a woman who's in her 30s and who's got children versus a woman who's older versus, men on the same path. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. But I would say, Michelle, that a lot of that learning is not necessarily in the box that is called your job.
Yeah.
So, for example, I was in the Philippines. You just mentioned it, but I was in the Philippines with an organization recently doing some consulting work. And the boss of that team was Western. She was British. The whole team was Filipino, both of them, men and women. And one of the things she was asking me is, Mimi, why won't they talk to me? She's like, I know they like me. And I like them, but I cannot lead them. She'd been there about 6 months. And I asked her, I said, have you fed them? She was like, what do you mean? This is not like they're not like pets. I said, no, I'm joking. But have you given them a meal? She was like, no. I said, okay, get them lunch. Yeah. Just see what happens. So, I mean, I'm being a little fickle, but quite seriously, over the next few months, she built that into her relationship to make sure that she had opportunities to buy them lunch and they would sit around the table. Groups of them still didn't talk much, but 6 months later, now they're beginning to open up, right? They needed that cultural context of community, right? That's because how they have grown up, how they've established their culture is in groups. One-on-one wasn't working for them, right? So her taking them, she was thinking she was doing a good thing, taking Michelle for lunch and then taking somebody else for lunch. But all that happened is they just sit there very shyly looking at the structure and the hierarchy and saying yes, no, yes, no. She needed to look at how they had grown up, their own culture, where families gather around a table and groups share their food. It's not that dissimilar in Singapore. Malaysia's the same, Indonesia to a certain extent. Where these cultures are community-driven, high-context cultures, you don't necessarily have to learn that in your job.
Yeah.
You have to know that by living there.
Yeah.
Right? So sometimes it's just a matter of looking around at the country you're in, even if it's for a week, and referencing what do you see out of work that might be impacting what you're seeing in work.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And the whole eating thing is, like coming here, my first few months, like I ate lunch with the team and, but I just gained so much weight in my first 2 months because like my body just wasn't used to eating like, noodles and ramen and rice. And, it honestly got to the point where I was like, I cannot go on like this. So I'm just not going to fit in my clothes. So like I pulled back and started to kind of bring my own lunch and did what I used to do in the UK, which is kind of just like eat my little salad at my desk and work through lunch. But I noticed over time my professional relationships decline because I wasn't having that social time. I wasn't, taking that full hour lunch break, going and having a meal with everybody. And it's hard to come back from that as well.
It is. I think especially when you have some level of racial segregation, right? The Easterners know that the Westerners tend to do that. But they don't, right? So then they're going to leave you out.
Yeah.
Because they think, oh, that Western lady, she wants to eat her salad on her own, right? Which is true. We do that.
Yeah.
But then they're going to stop inviting you. So you're right. It's quite hard to come back from that. So you have to kind of find a balance, I think, of the culture, the local culture you're in.
Yeah.
And your own, sort of boundaries and the things that you love and being yourself, because you don't want to be fake.
Yes.
But you also want to connect.
Yeah.
So you have to have that kind of authentic middle ground.
Yeah, exactly. And I think from a lot of what you're saying, so much of it is observation. When you're working in, a new continent, a new country, is taking the time to really look around and observe and understand culture as it is. Like, it's not necessarily part of the job and shouldn't be seen as part of the job. It's part of life of living in a foreign land.
And listening is such a huge part of that. I think what's really interesting as well is that whilst every country has its own unique culture and unique nuances and foods and cultures and languages and religions and all of those things, the more I travel, the more I realize we're all pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Right. So the way that we do things is different. The way that we communicate is different. But there are so many similarities between us. As you said, it's just about observing them and finding them. So I can often, for example, reference husbands with female leaders and the role of husbands or the role of men in our lives in a similar way in some countries in Asia, some countries in Africa, even some countries in Eastern Europe. The relationships are similar. The context is different. But the relationships are similar. But you're absolutely right. The only reason I know that is because I listen to them, right? So I have enough conversations to say, didn't I hear this in India, right? And then I'll hear it again. I think, okay, but now I'm in Oman.
Yeah.
Right? What is connecting? Well, women are connecting this, right? These relationships, these opinions. So listening is, it's a lot of what I guess I teach, but is probably, I don't know, our greatest superpower, to truly be able to listen with that intention of understanding versus replying, for example.
And it is that listening with intention.
Yeah. You're a podcast host. You're brilliant at it, right? You do it every time you record. But in life, you have to learn it. We tell each other to listen. But when do we teach each other to listen? So children, we do it all the time, right? If you have small children, you constantly say, listen to mummy, listen to daddy, listen to auntie, listen to teacher, right? All the time.
Please, for God's sake, just listen to me.
But then they grow up and we stop. We don't teach our kids in high school, in university. We're certainly not teaching it in the workplace. And yet it is probably the foundation to every relationship we have. So I think it's having a bit of a renaissance now. When I think of my own work, I can see it. Certainly people are sort of putting more prominence and relevance around this idea of empathy, of listening, of curiosity. But we certainly went through about 15 years there where nobody cared.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes it feels a little bit like that now as well.
So
with some of the changes that are happening in the world. So if you're a leader and you want to hone your skill of empathy, what are the things that we need to do?
So fundamentally, it does all come back to listening. I believe that listening is the backbone to all empathy, because if you don't listen, you can't understand. It's the same when people ask me about inclusion in the workplace. You can't include someone if you don't understand them. Or psychological safety. How do you create safe spaces if you don't know what safe means to them, right? Yeah. So all empathy comes from listening. But in terms of how to do that, like if you, I don't know, put some tips on the table, right?
Yeah.
The first I would say is around eye contact. We are very poor at it and we're getting poorer at it. And that is because of our screens, because of our cell phones, right? It is far easier to avoid eye contact than it is to make it. And when you make it, amazing things happen, but you have to hold it a little bit, right? So you'll be amazed if you look back at all your podcast episodes. It would be really interesting to look at how many of your guests actually held your eye, because it's quite tiring actually for me to really look at you for what is like, I guess, an hour we're going to talk, however long we talk. It's a focus. You have to really, pay attention. So the advice I always give people is to try and remember the color of the eyes of the person you're looking at, because what that will do is consciously, it will say her eyes like a green or blue color. In that second, it's taken me to consciously learn something. Subconsciously, the other person has felt connection. So it's a phenomenal way to do it all the time, especially if you're at big events or networking or that type of thing. So the first thing is eye contact. The second thing is to use people's names. I think that our names are the first gift we were ever given, right? When you were born, people respond amazingly to their names. Yeah. That is why the service sector is full of people with name badges that nobody is using. Yeah, except me. I don't know. Like, I'm sure some people are.
Yeah.
But use people's names. And again, if you watch this back, you'll see that I've used your name often. I'll say, Michelle, that is so interesting. Or Michelle, thank you for... Because subconsciously, it's creating connection.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, I'm interested in you. I want to be here. Thank you for asking me. I'm trying to create inclusion between us, right?
Yeah.
So using people's names, so simple. Right? And so powerful. How often you hear people say, oh, when people say my name, I think of my mum shouting at me. That is literally how little we're using people's names that we associate it with when we were in trouble as a child, right? Yeah. So I'd say that's the second one. And then the third one is probably around body language and just making sure that you're conscious of being open, which of course, going back to culture, is slightly different in different cultures. But having open shoulders, leaning in, not uncomfortably, but being open, rounding your shoulders, showing your palms. So again, ta-da! Yeah. But if you watch it back, you'll see that a couple of times I've done that in this conversation. I don't know, self-trained in it now.
Yeah.
But how you use some of those signals shows to people, I want to listen. If I sit here like this, immediately, right? The energy shifts at the table literally in a second. You laugh, but it's true. All I did was cross my arms and slouch a bit.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're like, oh, I don't really like
she wants to be.
Yeah, she's done. She wants to go, right? So our bodies are so important. And it's not a science. It's just an awareness to showing people that you're interested in them.
Yeah. Oh, I love these. Okay. Eyes, names, bodies. Yeah. Or hands. Yeah. Jazz hands. Yeah. I think all of those are amazing. And what about when it comes to like asking people, like a question's important or, you know, okay, we've spoken about other cues, but can you question people or can that come across sometimes as maybe a bit much?
No, I think questions are critical, but how you ask them is important. So why is probably one of our most powerful super skills when it comes to being empathetic, right? Because if I don't ask why, I don't know why, right? I have to ask. But of course, there's a big difference between saying, why do you think that happened? And why? Why did that happen? Michelle, why? Why didn't you? Immediately, you're like, I don't know, Mimi. I don't know what happened, right? Versus saying, tell me why.
Yeah.
Why do you think she did that? Right? Immediately, you're like, oh, I don't know. Let's talk about it. Right? Yeah. So how you ask those questions is so important. And the words in those questions is also quite important. So why is a great word.
Yeah.
But how is also a really good word. So sometimes when we use the word why, it can be a little bit on the offensive, right? Attacking why.